When thinking about AI, one of the strengths I think it really has is if we were looking in the area of analytics. And I think that's such an interesting topic because analytics are big data, and that's the one thing AI is really good at. But is it great? And can it tell you the information you want? Well, today we're going to talk about that and talk about that. Well, first, you need a story to really make it work. That's something that interests you? Join us as we start discussing stupid. Hi, everybody. Welcome back to the podcast. Cole, why don't you kick us off and tell us what we're going to be talking about today?
We're talking about data analytics. Seems like a
Analytics.
pretty great usage of AI, honestly, given that
Oh, yeah. I
AI
agree.
is AI is pattern recognition at the end of the day. And what good is data without recognizing the patterns in it? And that's kind of been
Yeah.
the problem with it,
Not only
honestly.
pattern, but big pattern. I mean, big data. And there's a lot of information analytics, and it definitely overwhelms most marketers and most people trying to understand it.
Yeah. I mean, honestly, for the last 4 years, I've been with iMonkey. A big part of data analytics has seemed almost like a foreign language. Of course, I've dabbled where needed, but actually like understanding and making like a big impact with that data, it's daunting. I get it. But I do think there is an opportunity with AI to kind of lower the barrier of entry to, coming to conclusions with the data.
Definitely. If there's anything that I think that AI can do well, is it can look at data from a large data set or data sets and help you understand it. I always think back to a few years back, we had a customer that was having a big problem on their website. It was being very slow. And they were wondering if there was some performance issues, and we couldn't find any performance issues. But what we found in the web logs was there were constant hits to the site, like just this massive amount. And it appeared that it was some bots. Now they use Cloudflare and they wanted to block those bots. So I had them send me the logs, or I grabbed the logs and I tried to open them in Excel. And Excel, it was like 3 million rows or whatever. And my Excel just started choking. So I was not able to do sorts or filters and normal stuff I would do in Excel. So I used its Power Pivot component, which is kind of the predecessor to what it has now with Copilot, but it was its AI component. And I just asked it a question. I said, um, can you tell me the most frequent IP addresses in this list? And it thought and it ground and that, and I didn't think it was going to work. And it came back and it gave me like 6 different IP addresses that were like there that were like hundreds of thousands of rows. And so I was able to send that to them. They added it to Cloudflare. It took care of that problem for the most part. But that's the thing, is it looked through this massive amount of data and it was able to come back. And I think that's kind of the same thing with analytics.
Yeah. So what you're saying is a bot helped you figure out what bots were attacking you.
Exactly. Yep. Yep. And sometimes it is actually funny how often I use AI to help me figure out how to use AI.
Yeah.
You'll ask it like, what is the best way to write this prompt? What is the best way to do this? How can I get you to do this instead of that? And you're asking it. So it's that loop
It does.
that you go
Yeah.
through.
It does help that you can kind of like ask AI how to best interact with it, because otherwise we just I mean, the entire series has just been us doing, very, very minimal prompts and just kind of showing what happens when you use
Right.
that type
Yep.
of logic. But yeah, so back on the topic of analytics. So I was scrolling through LinkedIn the other day and I saw a post, and in the post, it was talking about uh, how data is cheap, insight is expensive, storytelling is priceless. It was by Tim Stoddard. And I thought he raised some very interesting points. He at the bottom he included a graphic in the post, and it was kind of comparing data analytics gathering and making sense of it to the process of building Legos. right? So
Oh, well, Legos, that's good. My son loves to build Legos. I loved to build Legos when I was a kid. So that's a great
yeah,
analogy,
I mean, I
or at least
love
I'm excited about it.
for something as complex as like data analytics and stuff like that. I think it helps to have an analogy kind of like this, at least for me. So, but so the post was talking about, so you start off uh with your data, which is just a pile of an assortment of different Legos, right? You have like black ones, you have yellow ones, different sizes and shapes, and then you sort that giant pile, and you're in this particular post you sorted by colors, but then you kind of arrange the colors in different way. Basically, it ends up with the Legos explained as a story, and it's just a house, right? It's a house with like a car and the trees and stuff like that. Well, while while the while the post raises a lot of interesting points, and good conversations about data, it also assumes that the pile of bricks to begin with is valuable. Is your right set of data, and that kind of reminds me of how I think you mentioned the other day, Google Analytics hasn't really changed their standard uh, data sets that they've gathered for like a long time, and
I think pretty much back to when it is. Definitely, even when they moved from Universal Analytics to now Google Analytics 4, I mean, yeah, some of the stuff changed, but overall, it still collects the same information. The information was always there, and you obviously can get fancy with Google Tag Manager and creating your own events and all that kind of stuff, and setting up your own campaigns and everything. But overall, you're right. It's collected the same thing. And so I like your Lego analogy that you're kind of bringing those together to see what fits and how it fits together. And I'll even take that another step, because this is something I did when I was a kid, and my kid does all the time, which is you take Legos from multiple sets and you bring them together to create something new. And I think that's one of the most challenging things that we run into with analytics. Is it's not only about looking at like our Google Analytics on our website or something like that, but also it's like we talked about our podcast. Our podcast, we have the analytics in Captivate, which is what hosts and produces our audio podcast. We have the analytics in YouTube, which hosts and produces our video podcast. We have our analytics in Apple Podcasts, because now you can do both audio and video podcasts there, and it tracks some separate information. We've got analytics in Spotify, for the same thing. It can do both audio and video, and we have analytics there. We have analytics in SoundCloud, and we have analytics on our website for what people are visiting. We have analytics in our mailing list, our emailing list, about what people are clicking and all that kind of stuff. And we have all this information, and it's all in separate things. So that ridiculous spreadsheet I tried to build that drove me crazy to try to do it, to try to bring it in and make
yeah,
some meaningful thing about our podcast. But overall, this is an area where I say this is where AI can step in.
yeah, honestly, because I mean, when you're just so yeah, Virgil, the spreadsheet that Virgil mentioned is basically just a gigantic, colossal uh,
Spreadsheet.
orchestra of our, well, okay, you can't really say orchestra because an orchestra is like coordinated and composed.
Right.
But
Yeah,
this
no,
was
very
a better analogy would probably be the pile of bricks from that post we mentioned earlier.
right.
No offense, Virgil, but
No,
uh,
that's okay. I mean, but I did. I mean, I broke one of the cardinal rules that you just talked about, something that I preach a lot, which is you got to know what you're putting the analytics together for. I mean, whether you want to call it a story, whether you want to see it understanding personas, a journey. When I first started the company a long time ago, I kind of used my background in instructional design, from education 4,000 years ago, and kind of said, back when I started in the late 90s, early 2000s, companies that built websites were big development companies, and they would really work on the technical aspect of it and how it all worked and that kind of stuff. And they get it. And then these were sites that nobody could find anything on, because they were built to technical specifications, never talking about what the user actually needs, so the user experience. So I kind of started the approach of, what if you looked at this backwards? Otherwise, what are the outcomes you're trying to get to? So what is the final goals here? And then you build the site backwards. And the argument was, actually the last page you should build on a site is a home page.
Yeah.
Well, it's the same thing with analytics. There's a ton of data out there, and it's great because you can easily see pages visited, where they came from, that kind of stuff. But if you don't really have a way to interpret that or even understand what you want to get out of that, it's not very valuable. So, you visit our site, what is the end result we want people to do? Well, ideally, we want them to contact us or keep us in mind for future projects, subscribe to our podcast, subscribe to our blog, whatever it is like that. There's outcomes that you want to do there. Once you understand those outcomes, you can kind of start using the analytics to help that pattern. And, it goes back to the podcast. We know the thing we want to know is, are we growing our podcast? Well, we can look at our listens and we can see that our listen numbers have went up, where we were getting on average, during like the 2 to 4 weeks after an episode went out, we were getting about 30 to 40 listens. Now we're getting 100 plus, I mean, so that's exponentially, more, and, it's going to get closer to that 200 range and keep going up. But what we don't know is anything about the quality. It could be somebody is hitting listen, they hear the first 2 words out of my mouth and they're like, "Oh my god, that guy's annoying," and shuts it off and never happens. You know, and we don't know any of that information, so we don't totally know the quality. But the benefit for AI is, you can put all this stuff out there and say, "Here's what I wanna learn," and you can see what it comes up with. And it's not always gonna be great. I've had, I've ran it across our Google Analytics several times, just kind of in that microcosm, and I've had mixed results. So, a good result was, I asked it, since our podcast joined our site or was put on our site and we moved our podcast to an area on our website, I said, what has it done, to our traffic?
Yeah.
And it gave me two pieces of information, which were really good. One, you and I assumed it really greatly increased our traffic on our site. And actually, to our monthly traffic, it only increased at 14%. Now, anytime you get a 14% increase, that's great. But I mean, considering that we kind of thought it would go exponentially up from there, we're finding that where most people listen to our podcast in their web browser, they're not listening to it on our site, which is okay. Um, but the more interesting thing is the one thing it did do is it increased the engagement on our site. Otherwise, people are going to that, they're visiting other pages, people are staying on our site longer and engaging more when they're coming from our podcast. That is what we wanted to see. And AI was able to help me understand that without me having to dig through 500 reports, build a big Google dashboard myself. And that I was able to ask a simple one sentence question and get a massive amounts of information.
Yeah. But again, I mean, have the goals defined, and it kind of it's shaping up to be kind of a three-piece equation in being successful with analytics and AI. It's um, you know, knowing what you want, and then clearly identifying what data you actually want to pull from. Like there's probably some data that like kind of corrupts the big picture for you, or just like makes it massive.
Oh, 100%. So one of the first prompts I ever did with AI was around, what type of things kind of are happening on the site. One of the things it said is, we're getting a lot of 404 errors. And for anybody who's not sure, 404 error basically means a page is not found. And I'm thinking, okay, we moved the podcast, those URLs changed. Maybe somebody's visiting an old link from somewhere to an old customer case study or something that doesn't exist in that. So I'm like, can you help me figure out what these pages are they were trying to visit? Nope, can't do it. Don't have that information. So why do you tell me this stuff? So this is a limitation of a system like this, because it doesn't have that information or it doesn't understand that information, it can't help me because ideally from a answer scenario, that's great. I know I'm having 404 error, but if I can't figure out what's causing that, that doesn't help me in that. And so I dug into our Google Analytics and had a hard time finding it there. I went into Webflow, which is what we use for our website, and I looked at their analytics and couldn't find it there. They're all recording the 404 error. So just because you know the answer you want doesn't mean AI is going to be able to give it. But again, what would be best in that scenario is that it looked at both Google Analytics and Webflow and brought all that information together, compared and contrast, and looked at everything. And I do think that that really is the big future of AI and analytics, and where AI can really benefit is when you not only just looking around one data set, but potentially looking around multiple data sets and helping you draw conclusions from that in there. And you really do have to kind of look at it as the 80-20 rule, like most things. You're not necessarily going to get the perfect answer. But the one thing I like about the way it worked is it would give me an answer and it give me the data behind it, which was really good. But more so it said, ask me this to get better information. And that was really helpful. And I've started to see AI tools, you look at from when we started this series at the beginning, the beginning of October, late September, early October, whenever we started the season, to now. And the tools have changed at least 50 times. I mean, every single one of them have updated models, they've updated ways. But one of the things they're starting to do more that I've noticed is they sit there and say, well, I might not have given you the information you wanted. So ask me this and I can give you better. Or here's things that I could give you off of here. That's going to really help from an end user perspective because they're going to do it and be like, okay, this didn't give me what I want. But people, a lot of times it's like search. People don't really know what's that next question I need to ask to get a better answer than I got before. And now AI is starting to say, I may not have given you the answer you wanted. Here's some things you could get from me to get that before. And that was actually a significant one on the podcast because when it asked, when I asked kind of about what this has done with traffic, it says, you may want to ask me about engagements, what it's done there. And I asked it about engagements, and that's where it said, well, it's really increased the engagement on your site, not as much the traffic, but the engagement on your site. And that's actually a really significant thing that I want to dig more into to learn about.
It's massive because you're not going to your analytics for like the numbers or like the dashboard. I saw another post recently, or might have been a YouTube video, but it was about the death of the dashboard. With kind of the advent of AI, you're going for conclusions and you're going to move the needle forward. Like that's what analytics are for. It's understanding why the people interacting on your site are actually interacting the way they are, and then taking your goals and kind of synthesizing those two things into the future of your site, basically.
Yeah. Yep. And I think that that's, analytics has kind of always been 90% magic and, 10% actual strong data practices. And I'm not saying that you can't do the strong data practices, but overall, people tend to, around SEO, around all that stuff, they tend to, be like, let me try this and see what happens there. Here's something that maybe you could help AI actually help you build a baseline and understand that baseline of where you're at now and then actually look at it. And I loved it that I can really ask it questions about trends like, okay, so let's say you're doing a new product launch or something like that. Instead of having to build all these events or something inside of, Google Analytics and create these massive reports, now you could sit there and say, we just launched a new product last a month and we launched one 6 months ago. What are you seeing happen? You did, because maybe internally you did different marketing efforts. Now you can kind of use it for pseudo A/B testing inside your analytics and say, what do you see there? There's a lot of potential, but overall, I think the biggest thing is people need to take that first step of really understanding their story and what they want to get out of it. Like what's going to be beneficial from you to understand from it. And if anybody on here is going, well, we just want to know how many people are visiting our site, then I'm going to say, yeah, that's not necessarily that helpful. I mean, because we know, like on our site, a ton of our traffic comes from one of our blog posts that somebody wrote like 15 years ago on Kanban boards, and we still get a ton of traffic on that on a daily basis, because it comes up number one search if you're looking for how to use OneNote with Kanban boards in there. And we've tried changing that story and tried to get them to push to other things, and we've had kind of mixed success. But it's one of those things that, if you just look at page visits, you think, oh, a lot of people are visiting our site, but the reality is when they visit that page, that does us nothing because it has nothing to do with what our company does. It just happened to be our project manager at the time wrote that.
Yeah, go figure on that one.
Yeah, yeah, you always have to laugh at it in there. Um, so before we wrap up, the only thing I want to say is, a lot of people have been also listening to these episodes for tools. The reality is there's not a lot of tools out there except analytic engines that have tools built into them. So otherwise, using the tool as part of the analytic package you're using. So most people probably use Google Analytics, so you're going to probably use that. There are big data platforms, and maybe someday we'll explore those a little bit, where you can bring in information from multiple systems and do that. But that is not quite where I think we want it to be, because the reality is that you can bring in all this information and you can do that, but then you have to map it out and you kind of have to be a database person to figure that all out. I have a feeling this is coming down the pipe. It's not quite there. You can't get like a Claude or something like that to access all these different systems and pull in the information and that kind of stuff. That's going to be more something that you're going to build your own custom, agent for or something like that. Or hopefully there'll be some tools that come out there in the market in the not so distant future. With AI at the rate that everything's changing, it could happen tomorrow and we'll find a tool.
Really imagine. I mean,
Yeah.
honestly, it's changed so much
Yeah.
in the last like half year. Yeah.
Yeah, it's crazy, crazy. Well, thank you everybody for joining us for this episode. We hope you enjoyed the topic, and we will see you next time we start discussing stupid. Just a reminder, we'll be dropping new episodes every 2 weeks. If you enjoyed the discussion today, we would appreciate it if you hit the like button and leave us a review or comment below. And to listen to past episodes or be notified when future episodes are released, visit our website at www.discussingstupid.com and sign up for our email updates. Not only will we share when each new episode drops, but also we'll be including a ton of good content to help you in discussing stupid in your own organization. Of course, you can also follow us on YouTube, Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or SoundCloud, or really any of the other favorite podcast platforms we might use. Thanks again for joining, and we'll see you next time.